For most of human history, a person might live their entire life having met fewer than 30 other people. No maps, no records, no way to trace who was related to who beyond living memory. By every rule of genetics, small isolated groups like that should have collapsed within a few generations. They didn't, and the reason is stranger than most people expect. 30 people isn't a lot to choose from. Over a few generations, without some kind of system, a group that size runs out of unrelated partners fast. And yet, when researchers look at ancient DNA from sites tens of thousands of years old, the signs of severe inbreeding that should be there mostly aren't. Something was actively preventing it. The first and biggest answer is movement. Anthropologists studying groups like the Jew/Honsi in the Kalahari have found that people, especially young adults, routinely left their birth group to join another one entirely. This wasn't random wandering. It was a structured, expected part of life. Leaving to join a different band, often at marriage age, kept the gene pool mixing across dozens of groups instead of staying locked inside one. Multiply that pattern across many small bands doing the same thing, generation after generation, and you get something researchers call a mating network. A much larger effective population than any single group's headcount would suggest. Both men and women could be the ones who moved, depending on the culture, though patterns varied. Some societies had men joining their partner's group, others had women moving to their partners, and some mixed both freely. This kind of move wasn't small or easy. It meant leaving behind everyone familiar, learning a new group's customs, and starting over socially from close to zero, all as a deliberate, expected part of adulthood rather than an emergency. But movement alone wasn't enough. Groups also needed to actually know who counted as too closely related to marry, and this is where it gets clever. Many hunter-gatherer societies developed detailed kinship classification systems, essentially social rulebooks defining exactly who was and wasn't an eligible partner, often extending to people who weren't blood relatives at all, but were still off-limits by social category. These systems could be remarkably sophisticated, sorting an entire community into categories that made the right marriages nearly automatic, and the wrong ones socially unthinkable, no genetics required, just deeply reinforced social memory. Anthropologists studying Australian Aboriginal kinship systems have documented some of the most intricate versions of this ever recorded. Systems so precise they could calculate, instantly, exactly how any two people in a huge network were related, without writing anything down. A child growing up inside one of these systems learned their exact place in it, the same way children today learn language. By simply living inside it, absorbing something too complex to consciously invent from scratch. Some anthropologists think seasonal gatherings, where multiple separate bands met up at the same time and place once or twice a year, may have been just as important as day-to-day movement. These gatherings weren't just social. They were functionally the ancient version of a much larger dating pool, all in one place once a year. Sites with evidence of these large seasonal gatherings, places like Göbekli Tepe in what's now Turkey, show exactly this kind of pattern. Far more people passing through than could have lived there full time. The incest taboo itself may be one of the closest things anthropologists have found to a genuine human universal. Nearly every studied culture, however different, independently arrives at some version of the same core rule. Enforcement wasn't always gentle. In many societies, breaking this particular rule carried some of the harshest social consequences that existed. From complete banishment to being treated as if you no longer belonged to the group at all. This system wasn't foolproof, and knowing when it failed actually makes the evidence stronger. Genetic analysis of a late Neanderthal from a site in Siberia showed clear signs of severe inbreeding. In an isolated, shrinking population near the very end of their existence. When a population got too small, too isolated, or too cut off from the wider network for too long, the protection broke down. That's exactly what evolutionary theory predicts, and finding it in the data is what makes the rest of the picture credible. Here's the actual evidence that all of this worked. A genetic study of Upper Paleolithic remains at a site called Sunghia in Russia. Around 34,000 years old, found close relatives buried together, but almost no sign of close inbreeding in their DNA. That means the people buried at Sunghia were almost certainly drawing partners from a wider, deliberately maintained network, not simply pairing off within their own small group out of necessity. Similar patterns show up at other Ice Age sites across Europe and Siberia. This wasn't one lucky group. It looks like a genuinely widespread strategy. At a roughly 34,000-year-old site in Russia, researchers compared the DNA of multiple burials and estimated the population these individuals were drawing partners from at somewhere around 100 to 200 people, far larger than any single camp, but small enough that it still required real, active effort to maintain. That number lines up almost exactly with what anthropologists studying living hunter-gatherer societies had already predicted was the minimum size needed to avoid genetic trouble. The genetics and the anthropology, developed completely independently, arrived at the same answer. What's genuinely still debated is how consciously any of this was understood. Nobody had a concept of genes or chromosomes. So was this careful, deliberate strategy or something that emerged simply because it worked better and got copied? Most researchers think it's a mix of both. Cultural rules don't need a scientific explanation to survive. They just need to keep working better than the alternative, generation after generation, until they become simply how things are done. It's worth remembering that plenty of cultural rules don't survive this way. Only the ones that actually helped a group outlast its neighbors would keep getting passed down at all. In a real sense, ancient humans were running a very long, very slow experiment without ever calling it one. Whether or not anyone understood the biology, the behavior did exactly what biology needed. That's arguably more impressive, not less. Here's the part that connects directly to today. Modern population geneticists studying isolated communities still watch for exactly this problem, and still see the same solution show up. Small, geographically isolated human populations today, from remote island communities to some religious and cultural groups, still rely on deliberately structured marriage networks or migration between communities to maintain genetic health, sometimes without ever using that language to describe it. Even the instinct behind most modern marriage laws, the ones defining exactly how closely related two people can legally be before marrying, traces back to the same underlying problem ancient humans were solving with far less information than we have now. The underlying math never changed. Only the explanation for why it worked did. But here's the twist almost nobody expects. This entire system, built without writing, without science, without anyone understanding a single gene, may be one of the oldest surviving pieces of human culture still shaping who we are allowed to marry today. Marriage laws, taboos around close relatives, and even some wedding customs in cultures worldwide trace threads back to systems that ancient humans built by trial and error, tens of thousands of years before anyone could explain why they worked. It also means something quietly remarkable. An entire species survived its most vulnerable stretch, not through brute strength or luck, but through cooperation, memory, and rules that outlasted the individual people who first agreed to follow them. The next time a family tree or a wedding tradition feels like just an old custom, it's worth remembering. Some version of that idea helped an entire species make it through its most fragile, easily erased chapter.